Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about the evidence updates coming out for use starting in December. So what I have prepared is a summary of the new piece of evidence that we've introduced for the affirmative side. Elysia will go over the evidence for the negative side, but as a quick sort of introduction to what this evidence update looks like, what it's for, the evidence update is essentially sort of, we are taking sort of targeted, like, okay, we need an extra piece of evidence here to answer a particular argument in a particular AF or a particular disadvantage. So we're adding in 1, 2, maybe 3 different cards, right, pieces of evidence to answer those arguments. So this is not like a total rehauling of the evidence. This is not like adding a new disad or adding a new affirmative. This is just small targeted updates to fix issues we had with the evidence. And the way that you should go about like incorporating this is I think will come out or already is out in a separate like file or document from the original evidence packet. So you'll have to go in, highlight that piece of evidence, and then add it to wherever you're storing your blocks or your pre-existing evidence. So, and it is also for use starting in the December tournaments. So with all of that preamble out of the way, I will get into sort of the AF side. Now, the good news here is that we really only have to talk about one piece of evidence, the Barras and Groove evidence. Now, this piece of evidence is for the pandemics affirmative and specifically for the bioterror advantage that I believe you can read in middle school, varsity, high school JV, and maybe middle school JV. This is, again, just for the pandemics AF, and just if you're reading the bioterror advantage. If you're just reading the disease advantage, you don't have to really worry about this too much. So this card or piece of evidence, we essentially decided that we needed to have this in order to answer the argument that bioterrorist attacks have not happened in the past, or at least they have not been successful in the past. We thought that the negative argument was much stronger than the affirmative argument based off the evidence in terms of like, has bioterror happened in the past? Could it happen in the future? So that's why we've decided to add this piece of evidence in. So my approach, right. So my approach here is I'm just going to go over the 3 examples of historical bioterror attacks that this piece of evidence lists. I'll talk a little bit about them, who did them, what were their sort of like casualty counts, etc. So we have the context to be able to explain these in case we get asked cross-ex questions about it, or in case we decide to talk a lot about bioterrorism in our final affirmative speeches. But again, this is just like targeted just for the bioterrorism advantage on the pandemics affirmative. So the first example is the Rajneeshi poisonings of 1984. Now, I may be mispronouncing that, but bear with me. So essentially what happened here is that in 1984, there was a religious community that infected a couple of salad bars in the town of the Dallas. Not sure how you pronounce that. Essentially, they infected a couple of salad bars in a small Oregon town so that they could install their favorite political candidates into local offices, like county level offices. So they essentially sprinkled salmonella in different salad bars throughout salsa bars throughout the county, throughout the town. In a total, 751 people, as a result of this, contracted salmonellosis. 45 of whom were hospitalized, but nobody died as a direct result of the attack. So that is the first example that the evidence lists. The second example is probably a lot more infamous, is the Tokyo subway attacks in 1995. So essentially, in 1995, there was a doomsday cult, Om Shinrikyo, and there was going to be a police raid on their headquarters. So essentially, they dispersed sarin gas across a couple of lines in the Tokyo subway system, and 13 people were murdered as a result of this, died directly as a result of the sarin gas exposure. 50 were severely injured, and 1,000 more had temporary vision problems, again, as a result of this attack on the Tokyo subway system in 1995. The last example that this evidence talks about directly is the anthrax letters of 2001. So essentially, a week after 9/11, there were a bunch of letters that were laced with anthrax spores that were sent to different media offices across the country and sent to a couple of senators. So about 5 people were killed as a result of exposure to the anthrax, and the anthrax infected about 17 others. This part, I guess, is where it gets a little controversial and maybe conspiracy minded, but essentially there's a scientist, Bruce Edwards Ivins, who was working in an American biodefense lab in, I believe, Maryland, who is considered to have done it, but who killed himself in 2008. And so there's still a lot of unanswered questions about how exactly, what would his motives have been? Did he do it really, et cetera, et cetera? That is obviously outside the scope of this evidence set to really talk about. But essentially that is the anthrax letters in a nutshell. So that is a non-exhaustive list of different bioterror attacks throughout history. Other examples include Operation Dark Harvest in 1981, ricin letters, or letters laced with ricin in 2003 and 2013, a California medfly attack in 1989, etc. All of the examples that I've just also listed does not count the use of biological agents in warfare, which was a practice that stretches back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So to sort of reiterate, this piece of evidence is for use for the pandemics affirmative, if you're reading the bioterrorism advantage, and you would read this piece of evidence in the 2AC to answer the argument that there have been no successful bioterror attacks in the past. So that is essentially the one scenario where you would read this evidence. All right, that is the end of my PowerPoint.
Okay, so continuing on with the updates that we've made for the public health DA, we have a bit more. So we have 3 pieces of evidence in total, 1 internal link card and 2 impact cards. So as a reminder, an internal link is an argument about kind of laying out the extra steps of how we get from the link or the plan, or how the plan changes the status quo to actually causing whatever the impact is for the disadvantage. And the impact is just that bad thing that happens. So all 3 of these pieces of evidence are just giving real world examples kind of the public health disad, because a big note that we got on this was that it was hard to understand kind of like what the impact actually looks like, what it would mean for countries to use their militaries in the context of public health in order to kind of abuse human rights, or in a way that would increase authoritarianism. So these cards kind of lay out what that actually looks like in the context of COVID-19. So a quick note on how to use this evidence. We really want to stress that, like Manny said, we just made some tweaks based on what we heard, but all of your original evidence in the packet is still relevant. So please don't throw out all of your old 2NC 1NR evidence and say, I don't need it anymore, I got this new stuff. So the way to use it is the same way that you use the evidence that you already had for the 2NC and 1NR speeches, which is that you're using it to respond to relevant 2AC arguments. And with the impact stuff in particular, you can optionally use it to kind of bolster the impact, but you don't have to read it. So just to be clear, because this is just stuff we're introducing to help you make a stronger case and answer the 2AC better, you're not just going to read the evidence and end your speech, and you're not going to ignore that original evidence that we provided in the packet. But let's get into what that evidence actually is. So to start, this internal link card from Diaz and Mounts pretty much goes into an example of how, when it talks about risking war, our COVID-19 responses that are particularly militarized can increase tensions with other countries. So you can use this to respond to both arguments that taking a military approach to public health doesn't cause anything bad, and to explain the kind of like risk of war part of the impact. So if people are just like, no, it doesn't affect relations between countries to militarize our COVID response, this is kind of your response. So it specifically looks at the relationship between the United States and Canada. So it talks about how the US has had a very militarized response. We've been using a lot of war metaphors to talk about COVID, like talking about having to battle it, having a war on disease, referring to the pandemic as kind of an invisible enemy. And because of the lengths that we go to potentially deal with COVID, Trump, when he was the president, talked about potentially putting troops at the US-Canada border so that, you know, Canadians can come in and spread COVID, even though it was actually United States citizens that were tending to, that were both having more infections and spreading it to Canada more than vice versa. So that is something that increased tensions between countries. And historically, the US-Canada border has never had troops there. So there's never been any military presence at the border between the US and Canada. So that is just an example of like, yes, it increases tensions when we militarize public health and our pandemic response. Now, our impact cards are going to look at some different countries. So the first impact card that we've introduced from Joseph and Nangeli kind of gets at the idea. So you can use it to respond to arguments that the military is good for public health and responding to pandemics, and also to respond to arguments that there wouldn't be any human rights abuses or authoritarianism. You can also use this just to emphasize your impact, but specifically, this is really useful for answering those arguments. So it focuses on Bangladesh and other countries in South Asia where the military has not been used to help with the pandemic, but rather to just kind of control the citizens and keep them from criticizing the government. So even though everyone accepted the premise of like, okay, you need the military to help maybe enforce lockdowns and stuff, the way it's actually gone is that there's been the spread of misinformation in order to kind of make the country look better. So underreporting of positive results and like, you know, just not being truthful about the results of tests and death and vaccination rates and things like that in order to make the country look better. And then using the military to detain people who criticize the government of various countries. So instead of just being like, oh, we're going to make sure everyone stays home when they need to, it's what really happened was the militaries were like either beating up or arresting people who criticize the government in various places. So this is something where it's like, the initial reasoning was just like, okay, yeah, pandemic response. And then what actually happened didn't have anything to do with pandemic response. It was really just about kind of controlling the people pretty violently. And then the last impact from Kashgarian, similarly, just another example. You can also use this to respond to arguments that there wouldn't be any human rights abuses or authoritarianism, or to emphasize your impact. Talks about the ongoing abuses of the Uyghurs. So if you see this, you'll see this word in the packet, Uyghur. That's pronounced Uyghur. They are a predominantly Muslim ethnic minority in China that has been enduring several human rights abuses from the Chinese government for several years. So China has used the pandemic to justify even more abuses of the Uyghurs because they say things like, okay, we need to use surveillance to make sure that, you know, people are doing what they have to and that we can catch when there's positive cases. So that justifies doing things like, okay, we need to know where you are at all times. We can force you to stay in your house. The evidence talks about people who were in their houses and the government like sealed their doors, so they literally couldn't leave their houses. There was an instance of, or there have been instances of being told, of Uyghurs being told, okay, you've been exposed to COVID-19, we need you to go to this quarantine facility, and then they get there, and it's actually a internment camp designed for re-education, where they pretty much say like, okay, your cultural beliefs and your religious beliefs are wrong, and they're like stuck there until they conform to whatever the government wants them to believe. And then there's also just the ongoing abuses that were happening, you know, before COVID, of like forced labor camps and forced sterilizations of Uyghurs. It's also just easier to force them into those places and situations because the military can now come in and say, okay, yeah, we got to take you away for lockdown reasons. So the government has increasingly used COVID-19 to justify policing the Uyghur population. So that's the crux of these evidence updates. again, you're using this to make sure that you can answer affirmative arguments about, you know, the military being good for public health or nothing bad happening, but you're not just reading these and then sitting down. All right, thanks for joining us.